If you look at a study we did in 2019 on cities and biodiversity, we found that we took, the 1,000 top cited papers over an entire decade of work. So they're really the 1,000 most influential papers. And 0.5% were from global south authors based in the global south. Yeah. So you think of the kind of information that you get in that sense. The solution for climate change for the world is not to rely on international treaties alone or local action alone, but to see that we get multi-level governance, which is a mix of all these approaches. If you look at Colombia, it is trying to develop a new ecological charter, which is part of the constitution, where it's looking at how can we create a place for biodiversity, rights to nature, essentially, providing rights to nature. If you look at the Western Ghats, for instance, Madhav Gadgil Western Ghats report, you will see that he was actually talking about how development should be redefined by local villages and then districts and then states taking their own path to development. And the nation state also playing a role, obviously, but all of this, putting this together in what Eleanor Ostrom famously called polycentric governance or multi-level governance, where local residents have some pathway to self-determination that develops, that helps them define their own idea of development.
Can development and ecological resilience truly go hand in hand in today's rapidly growing economies? That's the central question we are exploring today, where we delve into the complex relationship between society, environment, and governance. We also deal with the complexities of knowledge production, gain insights on polycentric governance and community action, and explore the importance of individual engagement in building a more sustainable world, including the power of local solutions in tackling global issues like climate change. And to guide us through this intricate landscape, we have the pleasure of hosting Dr. Harini Nagendra, a renowned ecologist and sustainability expert. Dr. Nagendra is the Director of Research at Azim Premji University, where she also leads the Center for Climate Change and Sustainability. With over 30 years of experience, her groundbreaking research spans forest conservation, urban sustainability, and the intricate links between human well being and ecological resilience. Thank you so much, ma'am, for joining me today. It's a pleasure to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here, Anirudh.
Ma'am, can we first begin this discussion by contextualizing the research landscape in which we are surviving today? We all know that knowledge production systems are mostly controlled by the global north. To corroborate that, I was just reading a report the other day that IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that disseminates scientific information. More than 62% of the authors in that report come from global north, even when Asia, Latin America, Africa have minimal contribution to the reports that are basically deciding the global discourse on climate solutions. So my question to you would be, do we have research from global south for global south?
The answer is not enough. It is growing. Things are much better. I mean, when I first joined the international global environmental change research community, I remember about 30 plus years ago, there was almost nothing. And in international these conventions or IPCC meetings or biodiversity meetings, there would be a real search for people from the global south. I also used to find it very strange that a lot of the documents were written about training, and they would say things like the global north needs to provide training to the global south. But we are the areas which have high biodiversity, which have high native species conservation. People live in dense populations in the middle of biodiversity, and I mean, take India for example, right? And are very protective of that biodiversity. So I think we have our own context here that we need to learn from. And what you really need is south to south exchanges and knowledge exchanges and sharing of approaches and wisdom. That is really low. I mean, you are talking about the IPCC. It's true that it's 60%, it's 62% global north. But if you look at a study we did in 2019 on cities and biodiversity, urban sustainability, more broadly framed, we found that we took, the 1,000 top cited papers over an entire decade of work. So the 1,000 top cited, I mean, the more papers are cited, the more influential they are. So they're really the 1,000 most influential papers. And 0.5% were from global south authors authors based in the global south. Yeah. So you think of the kind of information that you get in that sense. I mean, it's very little is on the global south, and most of it is written by authors based in the global north, who will never really truly understand the global south context, right? So that is a big bias, whether it's in our forests or our agricultural landscapes or our rural areas or our cities. This bias is strong, and it really it makes for the fact that any policy recommendations that are done on the basis of the global south is based on this knowledge that is generated, which just doesn't fit our context.
Ma'am, would you want to explain that how does this situation really pan out in a context where a solution is being parachuted from global north, and how does the context does not sit well in global south? So maybe listeners could better understand that there's a tectonic shift that we need to see so as to have local solutions that work.
Yeah, I'll give you two examples. One is the example of forests. And there's been a lot of discussion of what are the factors, whether economic or social or ecological, that can drive reforestation. Because we know we need a lot of reforestation and afforestation around the world. And these are broadly divided into two buckets. One is what they call the environmental Kuznets curve, which is an idea propounded by a famous economist, which says that once countries get to a certain level of economic prosperity, then they start thinking of investing in the environment. And this would tell you, for instance, they talk about countries like France the USA, which have reached a certain, when they started reaching a level of economic prosperity, then they started investing in tree plantation and recovery. That does not apply to our context because it fails to look at the fact that all of these countries they talk about, whether it's France or the US, they stopped cutting down their trees, but they're still colonial in their approach of taking trees from other parts of the world, which is our parts of the world, right? So they continue to have a demand for trees. It's just that they took them from elsewhere and started protecting their own landscapes. We can't do that, right? The second thing that they offer as an approach for environmental for reforestation is economic scarcity of wood. When you have wood that becomes scarce, you plant trees. And yes, we plant trees in India, but that is largely social forestry like eucalyptus. Again, it's an idea that's come from the West. And it's not, it's timber. Thinking of forests as a collection of timber based trees, which they're not. They're ecologically much more than that. What do we have in the global south for reforestation? You have communities that protect their lands, is sometimes indigenous communities, sometimes non-indigenous, but still local rural communities, which protect their land, which understand the importance of forests. We have, sacred forests across the country. We have community forests across the country. Those are our path, the Indian path to actually ecological protection of the landscapes. And that pathway is just completely almost, it's present in papers, individual papers. Nepal has a pathway like that, Bhutan has a pathway, Nigeria, so many African countries, so many Latin American countries. It's there in individual papers, but collectively as a hypothesis to reforestation, it's absent from the literature, which means it's not in policy recommendations, right? The second is an example on cities. A lot of the work on urban sustainability talks about sustainable cities as smart cities, and they say therefore you need to have smart approaches of looking at metering electricity, metering water, and all of that is probably true. But if you look at a country like India, the biggest obstacles are potholes, simple things like that, or having underground drainage systems to for sanitation and for water. That's very basic infrastructure, and when the global south cities lack that kind of stuff. I'm looking at Bangalore today. The road outside my house is completely flooded. Traffic is backed up for several kilometers, all because a 200-meter stretch of the road is flooded, and there are potholes, and there's no way to figure out when you're driving that how deep your vehicle will go. So if traffic is going slowly, and it's something ridiculous like this, which is really small and can be often fixed, which no money will go into because all of our efforts are focused on smart cities, which sounds more interesting, but is not that useful to our context.
Ma'am, in this very context, talking about the colonial vestiges and how we look at development as such, which you just pointed out. This century is being dubbed as the India century. We are looking at astronomical growth,
Mhm.
growth which we can define by in our own terms. My question to you would be that how do you see this idea of development taking shape in this growing India, and what actually is the place of human well-being? I mean, we all are privileged and we are talking about that we cannot go out of our home because of the potholes on the road. God forbid for people who are underprivileged, what's their situation? So while we are looking at this tectonic growth, where is does this human well-being factor come in, and how do you see the situation panning out?
A very important question. If you look at economic growth. So there's no question that India needs economic growth. I don't think anyone's debating that. But if you look at the kind of growth that we're seeing, it is rapidly the economic profits or the outcomes of this growth are getting even more concentrated in the hands of a very few. And if you, I mean, if you look at this kind of an inequity which is growing, you're right. The challenges are faced by a few people. We have climate refugees from across the country now pouring into our cities. And that's not because cities do offer prosperity and a better way of life for some people, but not if you're desperate migrant refugees coming into the city, trying to find a way to survive, who would rather be back in their hometown. So there's that part of it. If you look at our economic growth, we have to find a pathway that emphasizes well-being. I mean, Bhutan's gross national happiness index is a very good example of that. And the way it is looking at defining this, it's not easy for the country because it works for the country because they get a lot of influx of foreign aid. And India as a country obviously does not want to be dependent on an influx of foreign aid. We should be defining our own pathway. But how do we do this in a way that is not only defined by GDP? I think well-being is something we really need to look at. And for well-being, we need to have a lot of equitable distribution of wealth. We also don't realize that all this economic progress, our pathway to development that we have mapped out, seems to be developed based on the idea of a lot of infrastructure growth, urban growth. And when you do that, all of this growth is coming at the expense of ecology. It seems we're looking for win-win situations, but you can't. When you have a road or a highway from one part of rural India to another, it's going to cut through a national park or some biodiversity rich area, which is going to have really a lot of repercussions for those areas. And if you look at the Western Ghats, for instance, Madhav Gadgil Western Ghats report, you will see that he was actually talking about how development should be redefined by local villages and then districts and then states taking their own path to development, and the nation state also playing a role obviously, but all of this, putting this together in what Eleanor Ostrom famously called polycentric governance or multi-level governance, where local residents have some pathway to self-determination that develops, that helps them define their own idea of development. I think unless we do that, we're not going to have well-being.
Now, let me ask you the elephant in the room that I think the conversation that dominates happens to come at the center stage somehow. Do we see development and ecological resilience go hand in hand with where we are right now and where the government is looking at?
We should, but we don't. So India, the one good thing about what the way India has defined its pathway to development is that we do have climate action plans, and we are committed to climate targets, and we have not walked back from them. Many countries across the world are actually walking back from their net zero climate targets. We have not done that. So clearly, in our vision for development, we want economic growth, and we also believe that it's important for us to pay attention to our biodiversity, to pay attention to our forests, and to mitigate climate change. Now, that's as aspirations go, which is very important. But in terms of the practical aspects of how we're going about it, we are definitely in the short term prioritizing economic or infrastructure development over ecology in many parts of the country. And it's a tough balance. We really need to see how we can somehow have a balance. There will be inevitably some ecological cost to economic growth. And I think we need to stop wishing away that fact. It is true that we will need some of it. Some of it, for instance, let's say you want public transport, you want metros in all your cities, you're going to have to cut some trails. You want to have suburban rail expansion again for public transport, you're going to have to cut down some trees. But can we redesign our cities so they're not private car oriented transport? I think we need to be looking at that. Can we have place for pedestrians, for cyclists, for other ways of transport that are ecologically friendly? Similarly, instead of thinking of very large solar installations or very large wind installations, and we do need renewable energy, can we think of small local solutions? So for instance, many parts of Kashmir have these dams, Avakhad kind of dams, which are little. They're basically spun by water. These mills that are spun by water, and the electricity that comes from them is used for making wheat and making other kinds of things. Now, those kinds of methods are what we need to think of. Something very local, a local sat, maybe a local solar station, which you train local women from a village in rural India how to manage it, and so they get employment and the village gets power. Those are the kinds of ways in which we need to also supplement this very large national goals, and we need to be spending more time thinking about those.
Are there any successful case studies, so to say, or any country that's taking it head on with respect to balancing development and ecological realities and charting a way forward?
There are a few, in between, and I think they're all explorations that we need to look at. For instance, the Latin American country of Colombia. If you look at Colombia, it is trying to develop a new ecological charter, which is part of the constitution, where it's looking at how can we create a place for biodiversity, rights to nature, essentially, providing rights to nature. Brazil has some rights to nature. India itself is actually looking at rights to rivers, right? So this is a very interesting time where all these experiments are being tried. But what does it mean actually for a river to have rights? Can a river represent itself? I mean, you're a lawyer, you know this very well. In a court of law, I think we need to look at some things like that. But for instance, I find the Colombian approach extremely interesting because they are trying to enshrine it into law and policy also. And they have some very experienced ecologists who've been working with the government in this path. And part of this is, as a country that faced a lot of violence, is that they're looking at ecology as an approach to reconciliation between indigenous communities and the state, which I find extremely interesting for us to look at as a path forward.
Now, ma'am, if we were to trickle down this debate from national level and go to extremely local level, one thing that I often face issue understanding is we realize that global, like climate change, is a global problem. But obviously, local patterns and local circumstances happen to determine the drivers and consequences of how climate change takes shape. Would you want to explain the interaction between global climate change and local realities? This question is stemming from obviously we had a very rough season of disasters. We saw Kerala landslides. We saw numerous disasters happening in Himachal Pradesh, which happens every year. So, would you want to explain that interaction a little bit? And maybe that would also nudge us that there are local realities that we need to more focus on rather than what the global discourse also is.
Right. No, this is another very important part. The climate change, biodiversity, environmental change is happening at so many different scales and dimensions. And I think people find that overwhelming and unable to grapple with them. So for a long time, the discussion was, is climate change real? Then is it happening? Is it some distant future? We see that climate change is happening. And let's take Kerala, the landslides as an example. What is happening is that the amount of rainfall has not changed considerably, appreciably in India, but it's being delivered at smaller and smaller time scales. So you get a lot of rain in a very concentrated period. Now that is something that the country has to prepare for. For that, you need the forest to be intact. And what Kerala has done, as most of the Western Ghats has done, is embarked on an approach to intensive development, which is cutting down all the forests on these sensitive slopes. The moment the forest is gone, the tree roots are no longer binding the soil, and the soil can be easily washed away. Then you have actually built over the rivers and the lakes and the other water bodies, which took the water from one place to another. So you blocked water channels. It gets stuck in a dam or stuck in a lake or stuck somewhere. And when pressure builds up, it comes out in very large amounts, right? So that's the second problem. And then you have this problem of landslides coming in. So it's a consequence of local human mismanagement as well as global climate change. And this is a classic situation for anybody to play a blame game. So I see now a lot of local, for instance, city managers or municipalities saying it's not our fault, it's climate change and the US is responsible and so we can't do anything about it. Yes, I mean, climate change is there and the global north is responsible for for much worse emissions than India has produced. But on the other hand, there's a lot we can do to adapt and to fix things right here. So it becomes an excuse for greenwashing, which I think we should not allow.
All right. Ma'am, these were very well articulation of the problems at hand and how we are looking at these global problems from local context and everything. If we were to shift gears and start understanding the way forward with respect to how we are looking at, I think you've talked and written a lot about governance structures and what role they can play in tackling these crises at global and local level. Would you first want to give your first thoughts as to how do you see the way forward while dealing with this crisis, and maybe then I can follow up with specific questions about specific topics.
Sure. The the way forward. So Eleanor Ostrom, I go back to her words. She was, for those who don't know, the first woman to win the Economics Nobel Prize. and she won it for her work on local communities and talking about how local communities can restore the environment. But another very important part of her work, which people don't talk about enough, is polycentric governance, the idea of multi level governance. And in fact, just before she passed away, she wrote a paper. It was published posthumously after her death, saying that the solution for climate change for the world is not to rely on international treaties alone or local action alone, but to see that we get multi level governance, which is a mix of all these approaches. And I'll give you an example. Again, we'll take Kerala. If you look at what the Western Ghats report talks about, it says that local panchayats must first get together and decide in some areas. So it first starts with the idea of eco-sensitive zones. And based on GIS data of forests and rivers and hill slopes and sensitive areas that are ecologically vulnerable, it says these are eco-sensitive areas, but it doesn't say there should be no development there. It says that in these areas you should minimize development, otherwise you, even the local residents of that area, will not benefit from the economic growth because or everything's going to get washed away. So it asks for local panchayats to begin with to sit together and deliberate and say this is the kind of development we can allow. Then it says groups of panchayats come together, and then you have Zilla Parishad, and then you have district administration, and so on and so forth, all the way up to the state, coming up with a plan for itself. So there will be a state plan for Kerala, determined by Kerala, a state plan for Karnataka, developed by Karnataka. And then you have a Western Ghats committee that sits with representatives from all states that comes together. And all of this is within the national framework. Obviously, each state can't go off and completely do its own thing. We are a structure which is, in some sense federated. So we have a national government that sets out the bounds within which states can do their decision making, and it's state that then sets out the bounds with which panchayats can actually make their decisions. But this means that everyone has a chance to be part of the decision making of what affects them. And I think that really, it's a slow process. It's not going to be a quick fix. It's not going to be a panacea policy, which is a blueprint across the country. And I think that's the problem with our policies. We want a policy that works for Jammu and Kashmir, and it works for Kerala, it works for Rajasthan, and it works for Nagaland. And we simply can't have any policy like that, right? So I think we need to work at this kind of a polycentric governance approach.
Ma'am, while you are talking about this, does the polycentric form of governance a solution also to the problem of global commons? Because that happens to be one of the major issues when we are talking about common resources. So, would you want to deal with that as well?
Absolutely no. The global commons are the most wicked of all commons, and that's we've seen. For instance, no country is willing to politically come on board and say that we will cut down our consumption levels to let other countries progress, because it is politically suicidal for the government that says that within their country, right? So you have a specific challenge with the global commons where the local commons and the global commons are kind of in opposition. But if you have polycentric governance and each country has some opportunities for self-determination, then you have a chance for these countries to work together. So I think yes, absolutely, global commons are something that we need to look at. Everybody talks about the fact that we don't have global commons, but very few people are addressing what are the reasons why global commons are so difficult to manage. And polycentric governance is one definitely important approach to have to mitigate some of this conflict.
And ma'am, to deal with this with respect to this polycentric governance, do you see some of these ideas being implemented effectively somewhere in India? Like I am reminded of the fact that how Forest Rights Act happens to give some of these rights to again individuals who can manage forest as a resource of their own. So that definitely gives them the idea of ownership. But then again, it comes with so many problems of bureaucracy and
Mm.
problems with respect to how can they really effectively manage if they can't use the resource for their own good. So would you want to also want to deal with that?
Yeah, I'll give you the example of Nepal actually. So Nepal, which is also a country where I've done a lot of research. So if you look at Nepal, in the 90s, they came up with the idea of community forestry. In fact, that's where India got its joint forest management inspiration from. And Nepal started the idea of community forestry by saying local communities can and local villages can get rights over their forests. And they were supposed to ban grazing or limit grazing, firewood collection, and cutting down of trees. Forests would regenerate, and they said as an incentive communities could cut trees after some time, not all the trees but some amount of trees, for timber rights and get the money from them. That turned out to be an extraordinarily successful program, and Nepal saw a great deal of reforestation. This is just after, the 70s and 80s, where there was this discussion that Nepal would go through a complete wave of deforestation and the Himalayas would collapse. There was a lot of discussion about that. And so we saw that, this was overturned. The forest started regenerating on hill slopes. Then the Nepali government came in and said, oh my goodness, this is all this timber that is going away to local communities. We will take back this land. Take back, as in, forest, like in India, forests belong to the state, but the timber rights they had handed over to local communities and they planned to take it back. But because there were so many community forests across the country, they federated and created an organization called FICOFON, the Federated Community Forestry Users Network of Nepal. And that organization became extremely politically active and a very strong political voice. And because of their collective bargaining, the Nepali government walked back that policy and said communities can still have the right to a sale of the produce. Now, the income from the sale of the produce does not go to individuals. That's very important because if it did, then there would be a perverse incentive to cut the forest. But it goes to local libraries, hospitals, schools, road development, anything else that is useful for the rural village to develop its own well-being. I mean, coming back to the concept that you said initially, right? And what we saw in Nepal was even during the worst of the Maoist insurgencies, the areas that had active community forestry escaped the worst of the insurgents because the local control was so strong that even the Maoists respected this and didn't touch those villages as much. So that really shows you the importance of this kind of community forestry and then the federation in working with the government to actually represent their interests at a political level. Right? And this is non-violent, peaceful, coordinated, democratic. I think that's the essence of the kind of approaches that we want to see.
And ma'am, from my conversation, the sense that I'm getting at, it is more about all of these issues can be dealt with more of a governance angle with it. But when we talk about the solutions that come out that are more so regulatory
Yeah.
with respect to how can we better manage it, do you think that the international community or otherwise the solution space enough recognizes this pattern of thought?
Not enough. A lot of the focus is not even regulatory. I would say it is technocratic. It's the idea that we can, there's some magic technology, some silver bullet will come along and we can just fix all our problems. This doesn't take into account human complexity and the fact that people need to talk. Again, coming back to a lot of the work of Ostrom, she was talking about the idea of cheap talk. And talk is cheap, the idea. It doesn't cost anything, it costs your time. But when people sit together and talk, they develop trust. And when they develop trust, they're willing to collaborate. And what we need is collaboration for solutions. And so that human aspect we've forgotten in all of this. And you need sanctioning, you need the monitoring, you need the regulation. Of course, you need all of that. That's very important. Just a paper policy is not going to solve anything. But the thing is, the paper policy or the regulation or the monitoring, any of that will only work when people are committed to making that change. That happens through cheap talk. So I think we've not given any emphasis to cheap talk anywhere in our documentation.
And we are just inching closer towards the end. And before I ask you your last thoughts, my question to you would be what encourages you right now with respect to the climate action space? What are the exciting developments that you are looking at? And maybe some of the projects which you find very exciting right now?
Sure. One of the things that we are finding very interesting is a couple of educational programs we have launched. We have a BSc in Environmental Science and Sustainability. We have a new MSc coming next year in Climate Change and Sustainability. And these are interdisciplinary programs open to people from all backgrounds, humanities, science, social science, with the idea that in India, we've always been very disciplinary. Environment, you have environmental engineers, you have environmental studies, you have environmental science. So we are looking at how can you bring all of this together to have solutions that use the best technology, that use the best approaches, but also are very strong on social science, are very strong on humanities and communication. So that's one thing that has been very exciting. We have the second batch of our environmental science and sustainability undergraduate program. 80 plus students from both batches, lovely students, very interesting, work. I'll give you one example. One of them was in Kumartuli in Calcutta, which is very well known for the Durga Puja, and looking at how the craftsmen used to use mud and local material, how they shifted to POP, and what do the master craftsmen feel about this change in the divorcing from the landscape of Kolkata, and what are their solutions for a sustainable Durga Puja. Very interesting work, right? So we have things like that. Another student just won an award for looking at plants on her garden veranda in an apartment and trying to see whether butterflies were nesting and having pupae, and actually, you got new butterflies coming from curry leaf plants. And if not, why? And what could people do to encourage biodiversity by growing a potted plant on a balcony? So a range of things. These students are very exciting. And the second thing that we find is we run a very large climate exhibition. I think the big problem we are facing is that young people are not exposed enough to environmental awareness. So we started a climate festival series. This is the third year. Our theme was rivers 2 years ago, forests last year, and mountains. We use the Indian idea of a festival or a mela, and we run this in different parts of the country. So it's going to 12 venues this year. It's trilingual, Kannada, Hindi, English. And in Bangalore, it's going to be for 14 years on 14 days on our Azim Premji University Bangalore campus. It'll attract 1,000 to 1,500 students every day. And that's really exciting. When you watch the students coming in, we use music, dance, theater, workshops, painting, as well as a lot of the best science. So I think that integration is very interesting, and we love seeing the students respond to that. So those are the things that keep me going in the middle of all this chaos.
And I think, as we were talking about earlier, the more people are empowered to talk about these issues, this means that all of these people will occupy the discussion space, and we will have more solutions, more problems coming from the people who are facing it, who are enough articulate to talk about it. So I think that's very encouraging, and congratulations for that.
Thanks.
Before we conclude the call, ma'am, are there any last thoughts, any call to action which you might want to share? Anything
Yeah, I
would
think
be, yeah.
climate change, biodiversity collapse, pollution, these are what the UNEP calls the triple planetary crisis, and we are in the middle of that. But I think there's also hope, and each one of us needs to get involved in our own ways. Often people think that it's so difficult to get involved. But I'd say you can get involved in anything. You can compost. You can look at, the trash you generate. Then you can start doing something with your community neighborhood to start composting at a larger scale. Or let's say you like biodiversity. You'd learn about birds and butterflies and trees. Then start doing nature walks for the children in your neighborhood. Anything. It could be a activism. Get involved. It could be working with the government. Ask your local cooperator if you can plant trees, collect some money, do a fundraiser. It could be working with the government. I think we should be doing all kinds of things. We shouldn't necessarily pit ourselves against the government. There are a number of approaches that people can take of all kinds, each one to their comfort level, but everyone should be doing something. Sometimes, we frame it as environmentalists as the bar is so high. Unless everything is in place, you're not doing something. But I think we can all do a bit more than we were doing yesterday. And sustainability to me is a journey, it's never an end point. So I think if we start on this journey, we'll get somewhere.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your thoughts, insights, and the incredible work that you are doing. I think a lot of us benefit from the research that you do. So, thank you so much for taking out the time for a call today. And I'm hopeful that we can learn a few insights from it and act on it as well.